US, where our correspondent there, Malcolm Brown, is standing by to give us a sense of what's happening on the international reaction front. Malcolm, thanks very much for joining us on the program. Give us a sense, perhaps from UN level, what's been the reaction to Zimbabwe? Has it been on the agenda?
Well, I can certainly say from the US perspective here in Washington, they are obviously watching it. This came as not as an extraordinary surprise, but it was quite sudden, I think. I mean, there had been this movement going on in Zimbabwe and clear opposition rising in Zimbabwe to the idea of a succession involving Mr. Mugabe's wife, Grace. But the suddenness, I think, has come as something as a surprise. Groups who monitor events in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, whilst this does appear to be a coup, if not in name, do welcome the fact that, at least to this point, there has been no violence associated with it, despite some reports of gunfire. It does not seem to be a state of great turmoil, and that's being welcomed here. But I think everybody's watching. There's been no official comment yet from the White House or the State Department. We have put in requests for the State Department to see what they're saying about that. We have noted, of course, that the US Embassy in Harare has instructed its staff overnight to stay at home, to work from home, and told US nationals in Zimbabwe to shelter at home whilst the situation hopefully becomes clearer.
There's some US companies that operate out of Zimbabwe, and any word about them or any reaction? Have they issued any warnings at all? Do you know?
Not that we've seen, but you'd have to imagine they're going to take, if not take their lead from the US State Department, they'll certainly be mirroring that kind of response. When there's such uncertainty at the moment, you'd have to imagine that everyone's laying low, and operations are, to some extent, being affected, you would imagine, certainly in the areas, any kind of governmental area or passage through government areas, you'd have to imagine that there is an impact there. But we haven't seen formal response from the commercial business sector, no.
We believe that the AU Commission Chair, Musa Faki Mahamat, might be in the US at this stage. Have you had a chance to come across him or hear any comments that have come out from the AU?
No, but they're due to be making a speech very shortly here in Washington, and it's actually quite a busy US Africa Policy Week here in Washington by coincidence. So a high-level dialogue involving both the AU and the United States is due to take place tomorrow, Thursday, and then on Friday, 37 African foreign ministers, sub-Saharan and from the Maghreb, are due to be congregating here in Washington as part of a drive by the Trump administration to broaden and deepen ties on the continent. So that's all coincidental. You'd have to imagine that, given events in Zimbabwe that are unfolding at the moment, that's going to shoot up to the top of the agenda.
So President Mugabe has often been, any opportunity he had at the UN to speak out against Europe, particularly Britain, and the US, always sort of coming into sharp focus. So one wouldn't think that there's too many people that are distraught, sad, or unhappy if President Mugabe actually is on the brink of losing power.
Yeah, there's not a big pro-Mugabe constituency here in the United States, and it's hard to imagine that any tears would be shed from an official perspective here. That said, there's always concern when you have what amounts to a coup taking place, and everyone will want to see what unfolds. I did speak to Thomas Tomaszewski. He's the Africa director at the International Republican Institute here, which is a pro-democracy, pro-freedom organization which promotes those values around the world. And he said that what his organization would be looking for is some kind of transition that's inclusive. And I think you're likely to see that mirrored by the Trump administration when they do get to speak later, either today or in the coming days. Nobody in the US is likely to want to see one strong man leader replaced by another without some form of democratic reform. Of course, we'll all remember that the US has had some form of sanctions leveled against Zimbabwe since 2001, and the goal is those sanctions will only be lifted, Washington says, if they see credible, transparent, and lasting democratic reforms.
All right, so those punitive sanctions in terms of getting funding from bodies such as IMF, I just wonder, is there a precedent set at all about how America is likely to react to a country where there is a coup that's been proven? What's their normal protocol? I know it's a new administration, but the US in the past, what sort of position does it take with states like that?
Well, traditionally, obviously, the US is not in favor of coups, but they will at some point, once the dust is settled, deal with the de facto situation on the ground, and they wouldn't want to be seen to be encouraging coups around the world. And as you point out, we haven't really seen a Trump administration responding to a transition of this sort since President Trump came to office earlier this year. So this will be something of a test. It's also a part of the world where the administration hasn't been heavily focused. We've just seen President Trump returning from a very long trip around Asia. And as I mentioned, we are now seeing the administration turn its focus somewhat to Africa. And they haven't totally ignored Africa. There is interest. You saw Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, Washington's ambassador to the UN, just coming back from a trip. The energy secretary has also been to Africa. The US is clearly very interested in Africa as a commercial proposition. They see a burgeoning market which is likely to be of enormous interest to American companies, and trade is obviously a preoccupation of President Trump. So you would have to imagine that a stable and potentially stable and more prosperous Zimbabwe would be of enormous interest to Washington. And if a coup, or whatever we're calling this, a transition being the polite term, perhaps, could, if handled inclusively, peacefully, and so on, could be welcomed quietly by Washington.
All right, we've run out of time, but very briefly, is this on the TV screens in the US at all, or is it business as usual? They're focusing on baseball and other things.
Well, we've got a lot of politics going on here at the moment, but it is on the front pages of some of the broadsheet newspapers, yes.
All right, Malcolm, thanks very much indeed. That's Malcolm Brown, our correspondent in the US, giving us an update on the international view on how this situation in Zimbabwe is unfolding. Now, earlier on, we spoke